My stepmom mocked when I got $15 from my dad, then the will reading exposed her greed in public. My stepmom made absolutely sure I got nothing when my father passed away. She manipulated everything behind the scenes. She did not know about the account my father set up with just my name on it years before he got sick. She found out at the reading. So, my stepmom spent 3 years playing the long game to make absolutely sure I got nothing when my dad died. She thought she was so clever, manipulating everything behind the scenes while playing the grieving widow. What she did not know was that my dad had set up a separate account with just my name on it years before he even got sick. The look on her face when the lawyer dropped that bomb at the will reading was worth every second of her fake tears and manipulation. Let me back up and give you the full picture of this mess. I am 29 years old and an only child. My mom passed away from cancer when I was 12. It was just me and my dad for about 4 years after that. And honestly, those were some of the best years of my life despite the grief. Dad worked as a financial advisor and made decent money. He taught me about investing, how to manage finances, and basically prepared me to be financially independent. We had this ritual where every Sunday morning we would go through the stock market section together and talk about companies and investments. He wanted me to understand money because he said too many people go through life completely clueless about finances and end up getting screwed. When I was 16, Dad met Patricia at some charity event. She was 42 at the time. He was 48. Patricia worked as a dental hygienist and had 2 children from a previous marriage. Her daughter Brittany was 14 and her son Austin was 11. Right off the bat, I could tell Patricia was different around my dad versus how she was around everyone else. When Dad was in the room, she was this sweet, caring woman who just wanted to blend families and make everyone happy. The second he left, her whole personality changed. I tried telling Dad about it a few months into their relationship, how Patricia would make snide comments about my mom's old belongings still being around the house. How she would roll her eyes when I talked about college plans. How she treated me like I was some annoying obstacle to her perfect new life. Dad just brushed it off as adjustment period stuff and said I needed to give her a chance. He was lonely and wanted companionship. And I get that, but he was also blind to what was really happening. They got married when I was 17. The wedding was this big production that Patricia planned entirely around what she wanted. She picked the venue, the flowers, the food, everything. Dad just went along with whatever made her happy. I remember standing there in my uncomfortable rental tux, thinking this was a huge mistake. But what was I supposed to do? He was an adult making his own choices. After the wedding, things got worse. Patricia moved into our house with Brittany and Austin. Suddenly, I went from having a close relationship with my dad to barely seeing him because Patricia always needed something. She had this talent for creating emergencies and drama that required Dad's immediate attention. Brittany needed help with homework. Austin had to be driven to practice. The kitchen faucet was leaking. The car was making a weird noise. There was always something pulling Dad away from our Sunday morning routine. Within 6 months, Patricia had convinced Dad to put both our names on all his accounts. Her reasoning was that she needed access to pay bills and handle household expenses since she was managing the home. Made sense on the surface, but it gave her complete visibility and control over Dad's finances. She knew exactly how much money he had, where it was, and what he was doing with it. I left for college at 18, which was both a relief and terrifying. Relief because I got away from Patricia's constant passive-aggressive comments. Terrifying because I knew she would have Dad all to herself to manipulate without me there to call out her nonsense. My fears were completely justified. Dad had always planned to pay for my college. He had been saving in a dedicated education fund since I was born. It was one of those things he was really proud of, making sure I would not have massive student debt holding me back after graduation. The fund had about $75,000 in it when I left for school. First semester went fine. Tuition got paid. I had money for books and housing. Everything worked. Second semester, Dad called me with bad news. He said there had been some unexpected expenses with the house and Brittany's car, and he could only cover half my tuition that semester. I would need to take out loans for the rest. I was confused because I knew the education fund existed specifically for this, but he assured me it was temporary and things would be back to normal next year. They never were. Every semester after that, there was a new excuse. Austin needed braces, the roof needed replacing, the foundation had cracks that required immediate attention, Patricia's car died, and she needed a new one. Brittany was starting college too and needed help with expenses. It was always something, and my education fund kept getting raided to cover these so-called emergencies. I ended up taking out $38,000 in student loans to finish my degree. Meanwhile, Brittany went to an expensive private university and somehow never had to take out a single loan. Austin got a brand new truck for his 16th birthday. Patricia got a luxury SUV. The house got completely renovated with new appliances, flooring, and a deck. But there was never money for my education, apparently. I tried talking to Dad about it multiple times. He would get defensive and say I did not understand how expensive it was to run a household with a family. He would remind me that Patricia's kids were his responsibility now too, and I needed to be more understanding. The man who used to teach me about financial planning and making smart money decisions was suddenly acting like money just disappeared into thin air with no accountability. Looking back now, I can see exactly what was happening. Patricia was systematically draining the education fund and using the money for her own kids while making sure mine came from loans that I would have to pay back. She was positioning her children to start their adult lives debt-free while saddling me with financial burden. And she was doing it in a way that made Dad think he was being a good stepfather and provider for the whole family. I graduated with my accounting degree and got a job at a decent firm. Started paying off my loans while living in a small apartment with 2 roommates. Meanwhile, Brittany and Austin were living at home rent-free while going to school, driving nice cars, and generally having everything handed to them on a silver platter. About 2 years after I graduated, Dad called me. He sounded different, tired, and kind of distant. He said he had been having some health issues and the doctors were running tests. He did not want me to worry, but thought I should know. Something about his tone made my stomach drop, but I tried to stay positive. He was only 58 and had always been healthy. Probably just something minor that would clear up with treatment. The test came back with the diagnosis none of us wanted to hear. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The oncologist laid out the treatment plan. Aggressive chemotherapy, possible surgery if they could shrink the tumors enough, radiation. Even with everything, the prognosis was not great. A 5-year survival rate was less than 10%. I immediately started making the 3-hour drive home every weekend to be there for appointments and help however I could. This disease moves fast and hits hard, and watching my dad go through treatment was brutal. He lost weight rapidly. The chemo made him constantly nauseous. He had always been this strong, capable guy who could fix anything, and suddenly he could not even get out of bed some days. Patricia played the devoted wife role perfectly for the outside world. She would post on social media about their journey and how they were fighting together. She would show up to appointments and hold Dad's hand in the waiting room. Everyone saw her as this amazing woman standing by her husband through the worst time of his life. But I saw the other side when it was just family around. Patricia would complain constantly about how hard this was on her, how she was exhausted from being a caregiver, how this was not what she signed up for when they got married, how she had her own needs that were not being met because Dad was always sick or sleeping. She also started talking about money a lot. The cancer treatment was expensive even with insurance. Dad had to cut back his hours at work, which meant less income. They were dipping into savings to cover medical bills and living expenses. Patricia made sure everyone knew how much financial stress she was under, usually right in front of Dad while he was trying to rest. Around month 4 of treatment, Dad asked me to come over on a weekday. He said he needed to talk to me about something important, and it could not wait until the weekend. I took a personal day and drove down, expecting more bad news about his health. We sat in his home office, which had become kind of his sanctuary during treatment. Patricia rarely went in there, so it was one of the few places he could have privacy. Dad looked terrible, pale and thin, wearing a knit cap to cover his hair loss from chemo, but his eyes were clear and focused in a way I had not seen in months. He told me he had been doing a lot of thinking about mortality and what would happen after he was gone. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of, but he also knew Patricia would be in a difficult position as a widow. He was trying to balance everyone's needs and make sure his death did not destroy the family financially. Then he said something that stuck with me. He told me he had set up some things years ago before he even got sick because he believed in being prepared. He said a good financial advisor always had contingency plans, and he had made sure there were provisions for different scenarios. He told me to trust that he had thought everything through carefully and that I should remember our Sunday morning lessons about patience and long-term thinking. At the time, I thought he was just being philosophical and maybe a bit out of it from the medications. The conversation felt important, but also kind of vague and confusing. He made me promise not to mention our talk to Patricia because he did not want her stressed about financial planning when she was already overwhelmed with caregiving. I agreed, gave him a hug, and drove back to my apartment feeling unsettled. Treatment continued for another 8 months. There were moments where we thought maybe, just maybe, he was beating the odds. The tumors would shrink a bit, his energy would improve, and hope would creep back in. Then the cancer would roar back worse than before, and we would be right back in the nightmare. During this time, Patricia became increasingly controlling about Dad's care and who could visit when. She would schedule things so my visits often conflicted with treatments or rest times. She would forget to tell me about appointments until after they happened. She started saying, "Dad got too tired when I visited, even though he always perked up when I was there." Brittany and Austin were around constantly, which was fine, but Patricia made it clear the house belonged to her kids now. They had taken over the living room with their stuff. Austin had converted the garage into his personal space. Brittany was using Dad's office sometimes for her grad school work, despite knowing it was his sanctuary. When I mentioned maybe giving Dad more space and quiet, Patricia acted like I was being selfish and did not care about the whole family's needs. The last 3 months were the hardest. Dad went on hospice care at home. He was in a hospital bed in the living room, barely conscious most days. Patricia hired home health aides to help with the physical care, which was necessary, but she also used that as justification for why I did not need to visit as often. She would tell me the aides had everything under control, and Dad was usually sleeping anyway. I came down every weekend regardless. I would sit next to his bed and hold his hand, tell him about work and my life, read him articles from the financial section of the newspaper like we used to do on Sunday mornings. Sometimes he would squeeze my hand or give a small smile, letting me know he could hear me even if he could not respond. Patricia would hover during these visits, always finding reasons to interrupt. The aides needed to turn him. He needed medications. It was time for his treatment. She would manufacture urgency to cut my time with him short. Then I would see Brittany and Austin sitting with him for hours without any interruptions. One weekend I came down and Dad seemed more alert than he had been in weeks. Patricia happened to be out running errands with Brittany. It was just me, Dad, and one of the aides who stepped out to give us privacy. Dad gestured me closer. His voice was barely a whisper, but he was crystal clear. He told me he was sorry for how things had worked out with college money. He said Patricia had convinced him at the time that combining resources was the right thing to do for the blended family, but he had realized too late that I had gotten the short end of the deal. He said he tried to make it right and to remember what we talked about in his office. Then he squeezed my hand and closed his eyes. That was the last real conversation I had with my father. He slipped into unconsciousness 2 days later and passed away 4 days after that. He was 59 years old. The funeral was a production. Patricia went all out with the service, the flowers, the reception afterward. She played the devastated widow perfectly. Black dress, tears at all the right moments, gracious acceptance of condolences. People kept telling her how strong she was, how devoted she had been, what an inspiration she was. Brittany and Austin stood with her like a united front. I was there, obviously, but Patricia had seated me away from the immediate family section. When people asked, she explained that I preferred to grieve privately and had requested space. Complete nonsense. But what was I going to do? Make a scene at my father's funeral? The reception was at the house afterward. People kept approaching me with condolences and memories of Dad. I appreciated it, but all I could think about was getting through the day and going back to my apartment to process everything alone. Patricia worked the room like a politician, making sure everyone saw her strength and grace under pressure. About a week after the funeral, Patricia's attorney called me. He said there would be a formal reading of the will in 2 weeks at his office, and my presence was required. The way he said it made it clear this was not optional. I confirmed I would be there and started mentally preparing myself for whatever was coming. Those 2 weeks were weird. I had to use bereavement leave from work. I was staying at a hotel near my hometown because there was no way I was staying at Patricia's house. She had called me a few times to coordinate estate stuff, when to come by and collect any personal items of Dad's I wanted, when the attorney meeting was, that kind of thing. Her tone was polite but distant, like I was some business associate rather than her late husband's son. I went to the house once during those 2 weeks to get some of Dad's things. Patricia had already boxed up most of his belongings and had them waiting in the garage for me. His watch, some photos, his collection of financial books, his old baseball glove. Seeing his whole life reduced to a few boxes was gutting. While I was loading boxes into my car, Brittany came out. She did not say much, just made some comment about how hard this must be for all of us. The whole time she had this look on her face like she was trying not to smile. It was subtle, but I caught it. Whatever was about to happen, she already knew and was enjoying my ignorance. The day of the will reading finally came. The attorney's office was downtown in one of those old buildings that screams old money and established families. I showed up 15 minutes early because Dad always taught me punctuality mattered. Patricia arrived exactly on time with Brittany and Austin. She was dressed in an expensive black pantsuit, looking every bit the successful widow. Brittany wore pearls. Austin had on a suit that probably cost more than my rent. The attorney, Jeffrey Brennan, welcomed us into his conference room. He was maybe 60, gray hair, expensive suit. The kind of lawyer who had been handling wealthy families' estates for decades. He had folders laid out on the table with our names on them. We all sat down. Patricia had positioned herself at the head of the table with Brittany and Austin on either side of her. I sat across from them, which felt appropriate given how this family dynamic had always worked. Brennan sat at the other end and opened his folder. He started with the standard stuff about this being the last will and testament of my father. Confirmed Dad was of sound mind when he created it, all the legal formalities. Then he got into the actual distribution of assets. The house went to Patricia entirely. No surprise there. They had owned it jointly. The value was estimated at $420,000 fully paid off. Brennan explained this would be hers outright with no restrictions. Dad's retirement accounts, which totaled about $380,000, also went to Patricia as the named beneficiary. Again, standard for a spouse. His life insurance policy paid out $500,000 to Patricia. She had been the beneficiary on that too. Then Brennan got to the investment accounts. This is where things got interesting. Dad's main brokerage account had about $240,000. The will specified that account would be split evenly between Brittany and Austin. So they each got $120,000. For college graduates with no debt who had been handed everything their whole lives, this was basically bonus money to start their adult lives even further ahead. I sat there doing math in my head. Patricia had just inherited over $1,300,000 in assets between the house, retirement accounts, and life insurance. Brittany and Austin were each getting $120,000. That was $1,540,000 total going to Patricia's side of the family. Then Brennan got to my part. There was a small account with about $15,000 that I had received. He explained this was from an old savings account Dad had maintained. That was it, $15,000. I could feel Patricia and her kids trying not to react. The smugness was radiating off them. They had successfully maneuvered to get virtually everything while I got what amounted to a token amount. Years of manipulation, of positioning themselves as the real family while pushing me to the outside, had paid off exactly how Patricia planned. But Brennan was not finished. He pulled out another folder, this one separate from the will documents. He looked directly at me and said there was an additional matter to address that was not part of the will, but was relevant to the estate. He explained that 8 years ago, shortly before Dad married Patricia, Dad had established a separate investment account at a different brokerage firm. This account was set up as a transfer-on-death account with me as the sole beneficiary. It was never mentioned in the will because it did not need to be. Transfer-on-death accounts bypassed probate entirely and transferred directly to the named beneficiary. The room got very quiet. I could see Patricia's expression starting to change from smug satisfaction to confused concern. Brennan continued. He said Dad had funded this account with $50,000 initially and had continued making contributions to it over the years. The account had been invested in a diversified portfolio of index funds and had grown substantially over time. Dad had made it very clear in his instructions that this account was never to be mentioned to anyone until after his death, and that I was to be informed of its existence at the reading. Patricia's face was going white. Brittany and Austin had stopped looking smug and now looked confused and worried. Brennan opened the folder and read the current balance of the account, $673,000. The silence in that room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Patricia's mouth literally fell open. Brittany gasped. Austin looked like he had been slapped. I sat there stunned, trying to process what I just heard. $673,000 in an account only I knew about. An account that Dad had set up years before he even got sick, back when I was still in high school. Brennan kept talking, explaining the account details, but I was barely hearing him. I was thinking about that conversation in Dad's office about him telling me he had set up things years ago and that I should remember our Sunday morning lessons about patience and long-term thinking. He had been telling me about this account in his way without saying it directly. He had set this up before Patricia could get her hands on it, before she could manipulate the finances, before she could position her kids ahead of me. He had protected my inheritance years in advance, probably because he suspected exactly what kind of person Patricia really was, even if he would not admit it out loud. Patricia found her voice first. It came out shaky and angry at the same time. She demanded to know how this was possible. Dad had promised her they shared everything. They had discussed his finances many times. He had never mentioned another account. This had to be some kind of mistake or fraud. Brennan calmly explained that the account was entirely legitimate. He had all the documentation. Dad had every right to maintain separate accounts and name whoever he wanted as beneficiaries. The account had been properly reported on tax returns every year. Everything was legal and above board. Patricia's face crumbled into pure rage. She started saying this was not fair, that Dad had promised to take care of her, that she had given up years of her life being his caregiver, that she deserved more for everything she had sacrificed. I finally spoke up. I kept my voice calm and level, just like Dad taught me. I pointed out that she just inherited over $1 million in assets. She owned a $400,000 house free and clear. Her kids each got 6 figures. She was going to be fine financially. But what really needed to be said was this. Dad had set up that account 8 years ago, right after they got married, because even back then, he was protecting my future. He had watched over the years as his education fund for me got drained to pay for Brittany's private school, and Austin's new truck, and Patricia's luxury SUV. He had seen how I ended up with student debt while her kids got everything handed to them. And he had made sure that in the end things would balance out. Patricia started crying, but they were not real tears. They were angry, frustrated tears of someone who had been outplayed and knew it. She had spent years manipulating finances and positioning herself and her kids to inherit everything, and Dad had quietly undermined the whole scheme with one account she never knew existed. Brittany tried saying something about how we were all family and this money should be shared among everyone. The hypocrisy was stunning. Where was that family unity talk when I was taking out student loans while she went to private school debt-free? Where was sharing when Austin got a new truck and I was driving a 15-year-old sedan? I told them the meeting was over as far as I was concerned. Brennan confirmed he would handle all the transfer paperwork for the transfer on death account and would be in touch with me directly. I stood up, thanked him, and walked out of that conference room without looking back at Patricia or her kids. I could hear Patricia yelling behind me as I left. Something about how this was not over and she had contested this, and Dad was not in his right mind. Brennan's calm voice responded that Dad had been completely competent when he set up the account, and there were no grounds for any challenge. The account was mine legally, and there was nothing she could do about it. I drove straight back to my apartment, which took 3 hours. I barely remember the drive. My mind was spinning with everything that had just happened. When I got home, I just sat on my couch staring at the wall for probably an hour, trying to process it all. Dad had protected me, even while sick, even while Patricia was manipulating him and draining resources to benefit her kids. Somewhere in his mind, he had held on to that account as my safety net. He had remembered our Sunday morning lessons about long-term planning and patience. He had trusted that I would understand when the time came. The $15,000 from the will was the obvious inheritance that Patricia knew about and accepted because it was a pittance compared to what she was getting. She had probably orchestrated things to make sure that is all I got from the will itself. But the $673,000 from the transfer on death account, that was Dad's real gift to me. That was him making sure I would be okay, making up for the education fund that got raided, balancing the scales after years of Patricia's manipulation. Over the next few days, I got multiple calls and texts from Patricia. First, she tried guilt, saying I was betraying Dad's memory by not sharing with the family. Then she tried logic, arguing the money should be divided equally among all the children. Then she went to threats. She would hire lawyers. She would fight this. I would regret being so selfish. I blocked her number after the 5th call. Brennan had already confirmed the account was ironclad. There was nothing Patricia could do legally to touch it. Brittany sent me a long text about how disappointed she was in me, how I was tearing apart the family over money, how Dad would be ashamed of my greed. The message was so ridiculous I actually laughed. This coming from someone who had benefited from my education fund money and never said a word about fairness. Then Austin's message was shorter but similar, calling me selfish and saying I should think about what Dad would want. What Dad wanted was pretty clear. He wanted me to have that account, which is why he set it up with my name on it 8 years ago. I did not respond to any of them. There was no point. They were not interested in actual conversation or understanding. They were just pissed that their gravy train had hit an unexpected obstacle named Dad's actual son. The account transfer took about 3 weeks to finalize. Brennan handled everything professionally and kept me updated on the progress. When the money finally hit my account, seeing that balance was surreal. I had gone from having about $18,000 in savings and $31,000 in remaining student debt to having over $690,000 liquid. First thing I did was pay off my student loans completely. $31,000 gone in one payment. The weight that lifted off my shoulders was incredible. Dad had wanted me to start my adult life without that burden, and Patricia had made sure I carried it instead. Now it was finally gone. Next, I paid off my car loan. Then I looked at my budget and realized I could actually afford to buy a place instead of renting. Something Dad always said was that real estate was one of the best long-term investments if you bought smart and did not overextend. I spent about 2 months looking at properties. Found a solid townhouse in a good neighborhood for $270,000. I put down 20%, got a great mortgage rate, and moved in a month later. Suddenly, I was a homeowner at 29 with a small mortgage payment and no other debt. I kept the rest of the money invested in the same index funds Dad had chosen. He had built that portfolio carefully and the returns had been steady for 8 years. No reason to mess with a strategy that worked. About 6 months after Dad died, I got a message from a number I did not recognize. It was Austin. He had gotten a new phone and wanted to reach out because he had been doing some thinking. He said he realized the money situation was complicated and maybe everyone had overreacted. He wanted to grab coffee and talk things through. I was skeptical, but part of me wondered if maybe he had actually grown up a bit and was trying to make amends. So, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my new place. Austin showed up looking rough. He had gained weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and generally looked stressed. His clothes were wrinkled, and his usual confident swagger was completely gone. We did the awkward small talk for a few minutes: weather, traffic, how was work going, before he got to the real reason he had called. Turns out Patricia had blown through a lot of the inheritance already. She had bought a new luxury car immediately after getting the life insurance money, some ridiculous SUV that cost $90,000 because she deserved it after being a caregiver. Then she had taken Brittany on an expensive vacation to Italy for 3 weeks because Brittany was stressed from grad school apparently, and needed to decompress in a 5-star resort. She had done major renovations to the house that were not necessary, ripping out perfectly good kitchens and bathrooms just because she wanted a fresh start. She had made some bad investment decisions based on tips from friends that lost money. Now, 6 months later, she was worried about finances. The retirement account she had inherited had some restrictions on how much she could withdraw without penalties. The house was paid off, but still had property taxes and maintenance costs. She had quit her job as a dental hygienist right after Dad died because she did not need to work anymore. But her spending was outpacing her actual available income by a lot. Austin's new truck had needed major repairs after he had wrecked it. Insurance did not cover everything, and suddenly his portion of inheritance was looking a lot smaller than he had anticipated. Brittany had burned through a chunk of her money already and was asking Patricia for more. The family needed help, Austin said. They needed me to step up and contribute. After all, we were still family. Dad would want us to support each other. I let him finish his whole pitch. Then I asked him one simple question. Where was this family unity when I was taking out student loans while he got a new truck? He tried to deflect. That was different. That was before. Things have changed now. I told him things had changed indeed. I had learned exactly what kind of family Patricia had built. One where her kids got everything and I got scraps. One where manipulation and selfishness were rewarded while actual hard work and responsibility were punished. Dad had seen it too, which is why he had protected my inheritance from Patricia's schemes. Austin got angry, then said I was being unreasonable, that I had way more money than I needed while they were struggling. That family helps family. The entitlement was stunning. He genuinely believed I owed them some of my inheritance because they had mismanaged theirs. I stood up and told him the meeting was over. I said I had no interest in funding their lifestyle or bailing them out of poor financial decisions. They'd gotten over $1 million from Dad's estate, and that was their share. What I got was mine, set up specifically for me years before any of them were even in Dad's life. He called me some names as I walked out, said I was just like my mother, cold and selfish. That one actually made me laugh because he had never even met my mother. She died before Patricia came into the picture. He was just throwing out insults to see what would stick. I blocked his new number and went back to my life. The next few months were peaceful. I settled into my townhouse, continued working, made some improvements to the property. I opened a separate investment account and continued following Dad's strategy of regular contributions to index funds. The holidays rolled around and I got a text from Brennan. Patricia had tried to contest the transfer on death account again, claiming Dad was not mentally competent due to his cancer treatments. She had apparently spent a lot of money on lawyers to pursue this claim. Brennan said it went nowhere. The account had been established 7 years before Dad got sick, and there was extensive documentation of his competency throughout that time. The judge threw out her case in about 15 minutes, and Patricia was on the hook for legal fees on both sides. Another expensive lesson in how you cannot manipulate your way out of legal documents. I found out later through mutual family friends that Patricia ended up selling the house. The combination of property taxes, maintenance costs, and her expensive lifestyle made it unsustainable without steady income. She bought a smaller condo and went back to work part-time as a dental hygienist. Brittany had to drop out of grad school because she could not afford it anymore. Austin was living with Patricia and working retail. The whole empire Patricia had built on Dad's money was crumbling because none of them knew how to actually manage finances or live within their means. Meanwhile, I got a promotion at work, started seeing someone who actually appreciates me and does not come with drama. My townhouse is great. My investments are growing steadily. I am on track to retire comfortably. Dad's lessons about long-term thinking and patience are paying off exactly like he said they would during those Sunday morning sessions. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if Dad had not set up that account. If Patricia's plan had worked, and I had gotten just the $15,000 while her kids got everything else, I probably would have struggled for years with debt, might never have bought a home, might have stayed stuck in that cycle of feeling like the black sheep who got nothing while everyone else prospered. But Dad knew even in those early days of his marriage to Patricia when he was lonely and wanted companionship, some part of him recognized what she really was. He saw how she treated me when he was not looking. He noticed how resources got directed to her kids while I got excuses. And he made sure that in the end his son would be taken care of. The last conversation we had when he was barely conscious makes so much sense now. He apologized for the college money because he knew Patricia had manipulated that situation. He told me to remember our office talk because that is when he had hinted at the account. He had done everything he could within the constraints of his marriage to protect me, and it worked. I visited Dad's grave last week. It was the first time I had been there since the funeral. I brought some flowers and just sat there for a while talking to him like we used to on Sunday mornings. I told him about the townhouse, the promotion, how I had invested the money the way he taught me. I also told him I understood now. The transfer on death account was not just about money, it was about him making sure I knew I mattered. Despite Patricia's years of manipulation and favoritism toward her own kids, he had never forgotten I was his son. He had planned for my future and protected it from the people who would have taken it if given the chance. Patricia tried one more time to contact me a few months ago. She sent a letter to my work address somehow, asking if we could put the past behind us and rebuild a relationship. She talked about how Dad would want his family to stay together and how holding grudges was not healthy. I read the letter, then threw it away. There was no family to rebuild because there never really was one. There was Patricia's family, her, Brittany, and Austin, who benefited from Dad's money while treating me like an outsider. And there was me, Dad's actual son, who he made sure to protect from their schemes. As the curtain falls on this personal story, let us look at the bigger picture. The story may have ended, but its echoes open up a larger discussion about the quiet battles that often unfold inside families, especially when money, loyalty, and inheritance become tangled together. What happened here is not just a tale about a stepmother, a will, or an unexpected account. It reflects a pattern many people recognize. In many households, the language of family unity, sacrifice, or blended harmony can slowly become a shield behind which manipulation hides. Resources get redirected, voices get ignored, and the person who speaks up is often labeled selfish or divisive. In this story, the father saw the imbalance too late to undo every decision, but not too late to quietly correct the future he feared his son would face. His preparation, patience, and foresight became a final act of protection that balanced years of silent injustice. And that is where the deeper lesson begins. When we step back from the drama of the will reading and the shock on certain faces in that conference room, what we really see is the long-term consequence of choices made over many years. One side of the family treated money like a reward to be consumed quickly, assuming the well would never run dry. The other side was taught discipline, patience, and responsibility. Those two mindsets eventually collided. The outcome was not merely about who received more money, it was about who had been taught how to live with it wisely. Sometimes the real inheritance is not the balance in the account, but the values that allowed it to grow in the first place. At this point, I want to speak not just as a storyteller, but as someone reflecting alongside you. When I look at situations like this, I'm reminded that setting boundaries is often misunderstood. People will say that refusing unfair demands is breaking the family apart, but sometimes the family was already broken the moment fairness disappeared. Sometimes drawing a line is not an act of cruelty, it is the only honest response left. It takes courage to accept that love does not require endless tolerance of manipulation. It takes strength to walk away from guilt that others try to place on your shoulders. And it takes clarity to recognize when someone's sudden appeal to family unity appears only after the money runs out. So now the story leaves us with a difficult question that many people quietly face in different forms. If a parent secretly protected your future from relatives who later demanded you share that protection with them, would you honor the parent's intention and keep it, or sacrifice it in the name of family peace?